To some, it seems like only 5 minutes ago, and to others, it may feel like a lifetime. But on this day, 2 years ago, Boris Johnson won a landslide victory in the general election. In the Conservative Party's strongest election performance since the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, Boris Johnson's Tories broke through the red wall, seats traditionally held by the Labour Party, and won with a majority of 80 seats. He'd become Prime Minister on July the 23rd after the toppling of Theresa May. But with Brexit and the coronavirus, amongst other issues, how has the PM fared in hindsight? To take a look in greater detail, I'm delighted to be joined now by Helen Dale, a political commentator, and also the day job is as a lawyer, so we shall both be very careful about the accuracy and the detail of what we say, rather than it just being idle comment. More seriously, it's great to see you, Helen, and thank you very much indeed for joining us. So, a year today, he won an 80-seat majority. Good to see you. An 80-seat majority, predominantly most commentators would say, on delivering Brexit. In your view, has it since unravelled, or is it just hiccups along the road?
I actually think it's frozen in time. In a sense, all of the issues that were being ventilated at the time of the general election at the end of 2019 that were coming to the fore, that were part of the Conservative Party manifesto, haven't actually developed much since. So we're kind of stuck right at the beginning of a general election cycle. And in a sense, with coronavirus, leaving Omicron, this new South African variant, to one side, in a sense now Boris Johnson is in the same position as an Australian Prime Minister would be, where there are only 3 years before, roughly, give or take, between federal elections, and you have to make your mark in 3 years rather than 5. It's like everything has been frozen for 2 years because COVID has just completely dominated everything. And you might get tiny bits of news like Liz Truss and the trade deals, or the small boats across the channel that periodically peek through coronavirus, but ultimately everything has just become about coronavirus, and everything has become about the government's response to coronavirus. So it's almost as if Boris Johnson got elected to do Brexit and to do certain things that were set out in the manifesto, and, well, not very much of it's happened.
Absolutely fascinating, because I mentioned to two of my earlier guests about Tim Montgomery, who was talking to Nigel and Deanna Davidson on an earlier programme on GBNews, saying the real problem with Boris Johnson is that he's lost the tax-cutting, spending-cutting agenda. I mean, in a sense, what you've just said very perceptively there is he had no choice, because of the coronavirus, then taxes had to go up to help fund the NHS, and spending had to go up to fund keeping people in jobs, the furlough and what have you. So whether he's in trouble or not, you're suggesting we're not looking at the real Boris.
I'm not sure whether we're not looking at the real Boris, but we're certainly not looking at Boris as he would like to be, in the sense of Prime Minister of this swashbuckling, buccaneering Brexit, post-Brexit Great Britain. And also the other aspect of this, which I think is worth mentioning, given you have a large number of Scottish presenters on GBNews, is the whole issue of the union has just been put on the back burner. Literally, it's just disappeared. And suddenly Nicola Sturgeon doesn't have the support for a referendum anymore. I thought we were heading down the path towards a Quebec-style never-endum. There'd be 3 or 4 of these rotten things. And that's just disappeared as well. The number of other things that have they're still relevant, they're still valuable, there are still people talking about them, but they just don't appear on the news, because the news has been completely colonised by everything to do with coronavirus. And this is why I suspect this latest dead cat of reintroducing a few restrictions here and there that are actually very damaging to nightclubs in particular, as your previous guest pointed out, is the reason it's not worked is because it's too close in topic or in area to things that were already going on. To make a dead cat work in the Australian sense, because it comes from Australia originally with Crosby and Textor, you have to have it has to be a different thing. It can't be sort of puddling around the same issue. Because as soon as you get that, as soon as people are distracted from the dead cat, they don't have to look very far to see a situation where the topic is intensely and closely related. So you've got Plan B restrictions, some of them, and you've got the story about number 10 Downing Street having parties. And it's a story that seems to be widening in the sense that there are now claims that journalists were there. There are claims that Keir Starmer went to one. I've seen this somewhere in another city, not in London, that shouldn't have happened. So it's sucking up the whole of the governance class, the blob, regardless of politics. Journalists cut across the political spectrum, politicians do, civil servants and so on and so forth. But it's the whole of the governance class has been sucked up in this, and nothing else is being allowed to matter. And we can decry that and criticise it, and I don't like it because I do think other things matter. I think the union matters, I think the immigration issue matters, I think free trade matters, that kind of thing. But I can't make that dominate a news headline. Even you can't in your position. So COVID has just colonised everything.
I was just chatting to Steve Baker, the Tory MP, who was also on with Nigel and Deanna just a few moments ago. We were just having a coffee and a natter beforehand. And he observed, adding to your list of things that are works in progress but can't be dealt with at the moment, he suggested that so long as they think in Dublin that this is a Prime Minister who may not be here for much longer, they're not going to cut a deal over Northern Ireland. And for the completion of Brexit and the successful functioning of both of the economies, particularly in Northern Ireland, that's also crucial.
Absolutely, that's as important, and I should have not neglected it in my earlier comments. That's as important as the Scottish issue, arguably more important than the Scottish issue, because support for the SNP is a bit wobbly. There are a lot of people in Scotland who are very cross about the situation with Scottish education and the situation with the Scottish hospitality and tourism industry. The first predates COVID, the second post-COVID. And this tendency there, Scotland is a polity in tension, in the sense that there is the strong tradition of the hijinks and the whiskey and the poetry and so on and so forth, which is very much about enjoying life and being entertained. But there's also that dour Scots tradition of like the Puritans with the theatres. They don't like anybody having fun, and the idea that someone somewhere might be having fun sometime in a nightclub is a bad idea. And Scotland's always had that tension, but so has Northern Ireland. And now you've got Northern Ireland with the border in the Irish Sea. It's just so all of these things that are just disastrous if they're not attended to, and now they've not been attended to because of COVID. And that doesn't mean to say that Boris would have made a spectacularly good job or a bad job or an in-between job, but the point is we don't know. Nobody knows.
Final point, and that is that if he is in difficulty, he has to think about cabinet colleagues, he has to think about letters going into Sir Graham Brady, the chair of the 1922 committee. He has to think about 60, 70 rebels on Tuesday over Plan B. But people out there are also thinking much more about one single thing, and that is whether or not the Labour Party are now presenting a genuine, credible alternative. When we said we wanted to chat to you, it was partly about 2019. But Labour have been out of power for the best part of 2 decades now. In your view, are they now poised to say, look at us under Keir Starmer and look at us with people like Yvette Cooper back in the fold. We're ready to go now.
I actually think, and I probably won't make myself very popular with my association for saying this, but I actually think Labour could do something at that vote on Tuesday that makes everybody sit up and take notice of it. And that is vote against Plan B. Join the Tory rebels, vote against Plan B, bring it down, because then the news headlines will be colonised by the fact that Labour has produced a defeat of a government with an 80-seat majority. Now, the instincts, unfortunately for Labour, they are embedded in what I have come to call the lockdown left. So they tend to have historically been throughout COVID even more in favour of restrictions than the Conservatives or the Lib Dems or the SNP. And that's just been one of those things. And so we haven't had a credible opposition, and that's what's led to concerns that a large number of civil libertarians and lawyers have talked about, which is the situation where bills have not been subjected to adequate parliamentary scrutiny, which has led to the situation where you often, particularly last year, you just didn't actually know what you were supposed to be doing because the legislation had been so horrendous and the guidelines had been so horrendously badly drafted. There were times when I was reading through it, and I have been a parliamentary draftsman. I have drafted legislation, and I couldn't work out what was going on. I had people asking me, and I'm going, I'm terribly sorry, but if I attempt to give you advice, I could be really wrong and blow my insurance. It's just so that's what happens with inadequate parliamentary scrutiny. But if Keir Starmer wanted to really get the bull by the horns, he could take the government to defeat over Plan B and then table a no confidence motion, which he would lose. But you would get that same, because obviously the Tories will back their own Prime Minister, but you would get that same sense that you got in 2019 of a government that was simply not in control of its own legislative programme. Now, I don't think Labour will take my advice because of their own internal problems, the whole culture of the lockdown left, but they could really, really give the government a massive headache. Whether that turns into more seats in 3 years' time, I don't know. For the simple reason that Labour has got this awful problem in Scotland where it basically can't win a trick. And traditionally, in order for Labour to take government, it needed to win a large number of Scottish seats.
Helen, I'm going to have to draw a line there. Just going to have to draw. I'm sorry, I could talk to you all morning, but I couldn't because I've got other guests as well. But leave it on that point about the arithmetic of Scotland as well. Intriguing. But that gauntlet thrown down to Keir Starmer, if you're serious, vote against on Tuesday and have a vote of no confidence. Even if you lose it, you will have made a point.